All right, let's dive into this. Andrew Jackson. Talk about a president who still gets people talking, huh?
Oh, yeah, he's definitely a lightning rod.
Yeah.
Still sparks debate.
I mean, it's been, what, like almost 200 years since he was in office?
About that, yeah.
And people are still arguing about whether he was a hero or, kind of a
A
villain.
hero for some, a villain for others. Depends who you ask, I guess.
Well, we've got a ton of sources here to dig into. We've got biographies, political analyses, even a clip from like a history podcast someone sent in.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite the mix.
So let's get into it. One thing that really struck me going through all this material
Yeah.
is how much Jackson's like early life seems to have really shaped him.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, talk about a tough childhood. Orphaned by 14, fought in the Revolutionary War.
It's like straight out like a history book.
It's more than just, dramatic backstory though, right?
Right.
I mean, a lot of these sources argue that all that, like, the violence, the loss,
Yeah, the instability.
really shaped his worldview.
You can definitely see how it might lead to some, maybe distrust of authority.
And maybe a tendency to, like, take things into his own hands.
That's Jackson in a nutshell, right? Man of action.
So did that kind of set the stage for what we call Jacksonian democracy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at its core, it was about empowering the common man.
Right, the people's president, all
Yeah,
that.
exactly. But he went about it in some pretty innovative ways. I mean, he really pushed for expanding voting rights,
Oh, yeah, like getting rid of property requirements for voting.
which at the time was radical.
Big change, yeah. He wanted anyone to be able to vote.
Well, almost anyone.
Yeah, good point. White men.
Right. It was still a very much limited vision of democracy.
Definitely. And we'll get into some of the not so heroic parts of his legacy in a bit.
For sure.
But sticking with this idea of Jackson as a champion of the common man.
Yeah.
That kind of leads us to his whole approach to politics in Washington, right? Like shaking things up.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah.
He was not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
Yeah. Like with the whole spoils system thing.
Ah, yeah, the spoils system.
Basically like firing a bunch of government officials and putting his own guys in.
Yeah, his loyal supporters.
So was he really like draining the swamp, as he put it?
Well, that's debatable. I mean, some sources paint it as this necessary house cleaning.
Right, getting rid of the old guard.
But others, they see it as more like cronyism, just rewarding his buddies.
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure. It definitely shows how he,
He definitely liked to exert his authority.
yeah, and wasn't afraid to make enemies.
I mean, one of the sources tells this story about this, like, really respected government scientist
Oh, yeah, I read that one.
who gets fired, basically, just because he wasn't a Jacksonian Democrat.
Makes you think, right? Like, how much damage did he do to institutions in the name of reform?
Right. And is that ever really justified? It's a tricky question.
Yeah, it really is. And it kind of sets the stage for, a lot of the other stuff he did that was even more controversial, shall we say.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
Okay, so we've talked about Jackson shaking things up in Washington, but his economic policies seem kind of all over the place to me.
Yeah, well, he was a complicated guy for sure.
Like, the one hand, he paid off the national debt,
Sure.
but then almost right after, the country's in a full-on financial crisis. How did that even happen?
Well, it all kind of goes back to Jackson's deep distrust of, like, big financial institutions.
Oh, yeah, he hated the Second Bank of the United States, right?
Hated it. Thought it was just a tool for the rich to, basically screw over everyone else.
So he vetoed its charter, even though, like, everyone was telling him it was a bad idea.
Yeah, he went up against Congress, ignored the Supreme Court, the whole 9 yards.
What a stubborn dude.
But, he saw it as a fight for the little guy, for the common man.
I get that, but how did killing the bank lead to, like, an economic meltdown?
Well, the bank, for all its problems, did do some important things.
Like what?
It had regulate credit, kept the currency stable, and acted as, like, a lender of last resort if things went south.
Ah, I see.
So when Jackson got rid of it, there was this huge void, this lack of oversight.
And that's what caused the Panic of 1837.
Pretty much, smaller banks went wild with risky loans, speculation ran rampant, and the whole thing just blew up.
Wow, talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah, Jackson really swung the pendulum too far in the other direction.
It's kind of ironic, right? He wanted to protect the common man from the big banks, but ended up hurting them even more.
It's a classic example of, good intentions gone wrong.
Makes you wonder if he ever had any second thoughts about it all.
It's hard to say for sure, but one of the sources I found actually quotes a letter Jackson wrote towards the end of his life.
Oh, really? What'd he say?
He was worried about the growing gap between rich and poor, complaining about, and I quote, speculators and stock jobbers who profited off the backs of working people.
Wow, so even Jackson saw that the system was kind of rigged against the little guy.
It seems like it, yeah.
That's pretty insightful, especially coming from him,
It definitely makes you rethink the whole hero or villain thing, right?
for sure. And speaking of complicated legacies, we got to talk about slavery.
Ah, yes, the elephant in the room.
Jackson was a slave owner himself, and his presidency took place right when the whole country was starting to really fight over it.
Yeah, the tensions were already running high. The fault lines of the Civil War were already there.
It's crazy. One of the sources even mentions that Jackson predicted a civil war would happen because of it.
Yeah, he saw it coming decades before it actually happened.
That's chilling.
And it shows just how divided the nation already was back then.
So, how did Jackson, a slave owner, deal with all this?
Well, he was in a tough spot, trying to keep the peace between the North and South.
But he must have known it was a powder keg.
He did, yeah. One of the sources quotes him expressing concern that the slavery issue could tear the country apart.
But he still owned slaves himself?
Yeah, it's a contradiction for sure. Like I said, Jackson was a complicated guy.
It seems like everything about him, from his economic policies to his views on slavery, was just like full of drama and conflict.
Always at the center of the storm, yeah.
Okay, so we've covered his crazy economic moves, his difficult relationship with slavery, his tendency to kind of like bully his way through politics.
He definitely had a strong personality.
But what about the man himself? You brought some sources about his personal life, right? Especially about his wife, Rachel.
Yeah, their relationship was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so their story. Um, it sounds pretty intense.
Oh, it was. I mean, think about it. They eloped, right?
Right.
But Rachel was technically still married to someone else at the time.
So yeah, big scandal.
Huge scandal.
Yeah.
And Jackson always believed that all the rumors and attacks on Rachel, they were just, political dirty tricks.
Yeah, to discredit him.
Exactly.
He was super protective of her too, like really took it personally.
Oh, yeah. Some historians even argue that, like, his famous temper.
The whole old hickory thing.
Yeah, a lot of that came from him wanting to, like, defend her honor.
Makes sense. Like anyone who messed with Rachel was messing with him.
Basically.
There's this one quote in a source you sent that really stuck with me.
Yeah, which one?
It's where Jackson calls Rachel something like the only solace of my life.
Oh, yeah. That's a powerful line.
It really shows how like devoted he was to her.
And how much her well-being kind of like drove his actions.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Speaking of relationships, the sources also mention how Jackson had some pretty volatile relationships with other politicians too.
Oh, yeah. He made a lot of enemies.
Major rivals like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, even his own vice president, John Quincy Adams.
Yeah, Jackson wasn't exactly known for his diplomacy skills.
He seemed to kind of thrive on conflict.
Oh, absolutely. He saw politics as a battleground,
Always ready for a fight.
Exactly. And he wasn't afraid to break the rules or step on toes to get what he wanted.
I mean, he literally challenged people to duels.
More than once.
Yeah. It's kind of like he brought his frontier mentality to Washington.
That's a good way to put it.
He was used to settling things with fists and guns.
And he didn't really change his approach when he became president.
So yeah, no wonder he ended up clashing with, well, basically everyone.
He took on Congress, defied the Supreme Court, almost went to war with South Carolina over tariffs.
Yeah, some people even called him King Andrew because he grabbed so much power.
He definitely pushed the limits of executive authority.
But I guess he always believed he was doing it for the right reasons, fighting for the people.
Yeah, he saw himself as the defender of the common man against, the elites, the special interests, all that.
So looking back at everything we've discussed, it's clear that Jackson was a pretty complicated figure.
Complicated is an understatement.
He was a man of contradictions, like a true force of nature who changed American politics forever.
For better or worse, yeah.
I mean, he fought for the common man, but also owned slaves.
He was a fierce nationalist, but also a champion of states' rights.
A war hero who wasn't afraid of violence, but also a devoted husband who deeply loved his wife.
It's that mix of, good and bad, light and shadow that makes him so interesting to study.
And that's why even today people are still arguing about whether he was a hero or a villain.
It's not an easy question to answer.
So to everyone listening, if you're still trying to figure out where you stand on Andrew Jackson, they're not alone.
It's a debate that's been going on for centuries.
But maybe the real point isn't about labeling him as one thing or the other.
Right. It's about trying to understand him
Seeing the whole picture, the good and the bad.
and recognizing how his actions, all of them, still shape our world today.
Yeah, like think about all the stuff we talked about today: executive power, economic inequality, racial injustice.
These are issues that are still front and center in our politics.
And they all have roots in the Jacksonian era.
It's amazing how much his legacy still resonates.
So, as you continue to, learn about history and explore the past, don't be afraid to dig deeper, challenge assumptions, and really try to grapple with the nuances and complexities of it all.
History's not always black and white,
Yeah, it's messy and complicated and full of
and
surprises.
that's what makes it so fascinating.
So, on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the life and times of Andrew Jackson. Thanks for joining us.